Rock Doc.
Neil Ratner Rock Doc here with another episode of Music is Medicine. My guest today is my old friend Stewart Young. Stewart started his career in the music business back in the early 70s as the manager for Emerson Lake and Palmer, and went on to work with an incredible array of artists, including Billy Squier, Cyndi Lauper, AC/DC, and Foreigner, among many others. And for my medical segment, I'm going to talk about something either most of us have already had or no doubt will: back pain. But as usual, let's get started with a couple of stories about this past week in the history of rock and roll. This past week in October 1963, Bob Dylan recorded the title track for his album of the same name, The Times They Are A-Changin'. Dylan wrote the song as an anthem for change and said, "This was definitely a song with a purpose. It was influenced, of course, by the Irish and Scottish ballads. Come all ye bold highwaymen, come all ye tender-hearted maidens. I wanted to write a big song with short, concise verses that piled up on each other in a hypnotic way." And the song's lasting message of change seems as relevant today as when Bob wrote the tune back in the 60s. This past week in October of 1968, Jimi Hendrix released the album Electric Ladyland. Now, we all know how much Jimmy liked his wah-wah pedal, and according to Hendrix, the wah-wah pedal is great because it doesn't have any notes. And Hendrix loved to experiment with new guitar gear and find their sonic possibilities. But Jimmy wasn't above using very common things to get the sound he wanted, like using a cigarette lighter for a slide on the tune All Along the Watchtower. But what he did to get the right sound on the song Crosstown Traffic was even more creative. According to his friend, Velvet Turner, who was in the studio, Jimmy said, "Do you have a comb on you, man? Give me a comb. Somebody get me some cellophane. If you take a comb and put cellophane across it and blow through it, it gives a kazoo sound." So for the guitar solo on Crosstown Traffic, the guitar is laced with the sound of a kazoo. And that's Jimmy with this particular comb, which I just thought was amazingly brave for someone to do. Jimmy would reach out and grab anything he possibly could get his hands on if he thought it could produce the desired sound for him. Hendrix was a perfectionist and spent untold hours recording Electric Ladyland. If you looked at his studio bills in 2019 terms, he would have spent more than $500,000 recording the album. Chaz Chandler was the producer and Hendrix's manager at the time, and Chaz got fed up with Jimmy and his antics and actually quit during the recording. According to Chandler, "I would go in there to the record plant and wait for Jimmy, and he would show up with 8 or 9 hangers on. When he finally did begin recording, Jimmy would be playing for the benefit of his guests, not the machines. We'd be going over a number again and again, and I would say over the talkback, 'That was it. We got it.' He would say, 'No, no, no,' and would record another and another and another. Finally, I just threw my hands up and left." Whatever. The album went on to be number 1 and is included on almost everyone's list of greatest albums of all time. Guitarist Peter Green celebrated his 73rd birthday this past week. After Peter's brother taught him a few chords, Green taught himself to play the guitar, and by the time he was 15, he was playing professionally. In 1966, Green joined Peter Barden's band as the lead guitarist, with none other than Mick Fleetwood as their drummer. But Green's real opportunity came when he was asked to fill in for Eric Clapton in John Mayall's band, the Blues Breakers. And when Clapton permanently left the band a few months later, Green was asked to join. Then, in 1967, Green decided to form his own band, with Mick Fleetwood on drums and Jeremy Spencer on guitar. The band was initially called Peter Green's Fleetwood Mac, featuring Jeremy Spencer. Bob Bruning was temporarily employed on bass guitar, but Green's first choice, Bluesbreaker bassist John McVie replaced Bruning shortly thereafter. Things went downhill after that for Green, who was an undiagnosed schizophrenic. But after some time in an institution and years of treatment, Green was playing again by the mid-'80s. John Anderson, lead singer and founding member of the group Yes, also celebrated, well, in his case, his 75th birthday this past week. His parents were champions in ballroom dancing, and Anderson was named after the singer John Roy, the Melody Boy. At first, Anderson had no particular desire to become a singer. That is, until his brother Tony took up singing and joined a local band. After one of the backing vocalists left his brother's group, John filled in and found music much more enjoyable and a better choice for making money than manual labor. In 1968, Anderson met bassist Chris Squire, who was in the band Mabel Greer's Toy Shop. The two talked and found they shared common musical interests, such as Simon and Garfunkel and the idea of vocal harmonies. And in the following days, they developed Sweetness, a song later recorded on the first Yes album. In addition to Yes, John has had a very successful solo career. A few years back, I went to see John up here at the Bearsville Theater, and he was great, let me tell you. But more importantly, his backup band were the kids from the Paul Green Rock Academy. And I thought it was really terrific that John would take the time to come and play his material with them. Very cool indeed. And finally, this past week, original Rolling Stones bass player Bill Wyman celebrated his 83rd birthday. Oh, my God. The Rolling Stones, we're all getting old, yeah. Wyman grew up poor in London and has said that his childhood was scarred by poverty, but he did manage some piano lessons in his early teens. Bill bought his first electric guitar in his 20s, but wasn't satisfied with his progress and switched to bass. Tony Chapman had been Bill's drummer in a band called the Cliftons, and it was Chapman who made inquiries about vacancies he had heard about with the Rolling Stones. And he discovered that they just might be found at the Weatherby Arms on the King's Road in Chelsea. So he and Wyman turned up for a run-through, and although they had doubts about the blues style and didn't like the name at all, they both agreed to join. Chapman didn't fit in and was soon gone, but Wyman stayed with the Stones until 1993. Bill did a few solo albums in the 80s and formed the band Bill Wyman and the Rhythm Kings after leaving the Stones in 1993. And if you are lucky enough to see Bill play with the Stones or the Rhythm Kings, you know how good a musician he is and how important he was to the bands he played in. Okay, a question. How many of you out there either suffer from back pain or know someone who has? I'm sure most of you have your hands up. Statistics show us the staggering figure that up to 80% of the people in the United States will experience back pain at some point in their lives. And while there are innumerable causes, the resulting symptoms many times feel the same. And that's why it's so hard to get the right diagnosis and treatment. Let's look at the anatomy of the spine for a minute. There are 33 individual interlocking bones called vertebrae that start from the base of your skull and run all the way to your pelvis. Between the vertebrae are discs, which have a jelly-like center and function as shock absorbers. And running through the center of the vertebrae is the spinal cord, carrying messages from the brain to all the other parts of the body via nerve fibers, which branch out of the cord through spaces between the vertebrae. So it's not hard to see why even minor problems with your back could cause pain and discomfort in almost any other part of the body and vice versa. The most common type of back pain is mechanical, meaning it's caused by either trauma or the wear and tear of aging, with arthritis of the spine being the main culprit. And the pain can occur at any age, from either one factor or a few working together, like any type of back trauma, years of poor posture, improper lifting of heavy objects, and even the effects of prolonged wearing of high heels. Hear that, ladies? Usually the pain comes and goes, but can be very acute at times. Rest and anti-inflammatories like Advil usually do the trick, and it rarely needs medical treatment, although many get relief from chiropractors. So it seems obvious that incorrect postures and putting uneven stress loads on parts of your body for prolonged periods of time will eventually produce back problems, which brings me to musicians. Guitar slung over the shoulder, violin under the chin, drum pedals under each foot. Each instrument has its own individual ergonomics. In one study, close to 70% of the musicians questioned reported chronic pain related to the playing of their instrument. Of course, not all of it in the back. Pain in the upper extremities from arthritis of the hand and shoulder was also significant. Now, most musicians attributed their pain not only to the posture and support their instrument demanded, but also the duration of daily exercises, including overly long and frequent performances and rehearsals, monotonous posture, and one-sided movements. Overall, 70% of those with pain reported back pain, 68% shoulder pain, 64% neck pain, and 40% wrist and hand pain. Okay, but what is a musician to do? First of all, if you notice any pain or any muscular tension during or after playing, try to figure out the cause. Anyone who knows their body will quickly be aware of any critical postures, movements, or pressure that can be the cause of their inconvenience. The intervertebral discs help support a heavy distributed load. Once the spine bends, the load becomes uneven, causing pressure and discomfort with potential long-term damage. And pay attention to small things because they ultimately have a great impact on your well-being. A guitarist, for example, who holds their pick between the thumb and the forefinger more firmly than is actually necessary will not be able to play relaxed. And the pressure exerted on the thumb and forefinger affects the hand, and then the arm, and then the shoulder, all the way down to the back. And this applies to all instruments. And it's not just limited to fingers, but also applies to other body parts involved in practice and playing, and pretty much to the same extent. And how many musicians concentrate on good posture, a key figure in bad back health? As a former drummer, I often suffered from a backache after slouching over my kit for a few hours. And more than one professional drummer has had to stop playing because of chronic back pain caused by years of improperly sitting. You know, it's funny. I worked with many professional musicians back in the day, and very few considered themselves in any way similar to professional athletes. But in many ways, especially on tour, they are. Almost all would warm up on their instrument, but very few did any kind of stretching or warm-up exercises for their body, something that we all should remember to do before any type of physical exercise. And like athletes, musicians need to work their way back into a reasonable playing schedule after laying off for a while, since that, believe it or not, presents the highest risk of injury. Stress is something not many of us think about, especially in relation to back pain. But when we're stressed out, we're tensing up various muscle groups, which over a prolonged period of time often expresses itself as back pain. So, musician or non-musician, if you have chronic back pain, what are some of the treatment options? Well, because back pain is so common, numerous products promise prevention or relief, but there's really no definitive evidence that special shoes, shoe inserts, or back supports will help. But there are a few types of alternative medicine that have gotten good results and you might want to try. Among them, yoga, acupuncture, massage, various types of body work, and biofeedback therapy. Also, believe it or not, for some, a diet change may help, especially if you eat a diet high in sugar and other processed foods which are highly inflammatory. And certainly, losing weight if you need to, and even certain cognitive therapies like meditation and Tai Chi have proved to be helpful. All right, I'll end with a story about Eric Clapton and what can happen with progression over time and inadequate treatment. What started with severe chronic lower back pain has now developed into a condition called peripheral neuropathy, which developed because of nerve damage over a long period of time caused by Clapton's lower back problem. In Clapton's case, it's affected his legs, and as Clapton puts it, you feel like you have electric shocks going down your leg. And the condition has gotten so bad that Eric is now seriously considering retiring. All right, so I guess the message to the story is pay attention to your back and certainly seek medical help if your problem is severe and frequent. Also, good posture, exercise, but stretch and warm up first. Be careful when lifting heavy objects. And most of all, relax a little. It's never quite as bad as you think. My guest today is one of the real backstage icons of rock and roll, my old friend Stewart Young. Stewart graduated from the London School of Economics and went to work in the accounting firm of his father in the early 1970s. Now, one day, his father called him into his office to tell him about a new client that he wanted Stewart to meet, a rock group called Emerson, Lake and Palmer. The band told Stewart they needed a manager, and he set out to find them one. But after an unsuccessful search, including an unpleasant episode with Peter Grant, Led Zeppelin's manager, the band persuaded Stewart to take the job, and he hasn't looked back since. Over the course of the last 40 years, Stewart has been involved in the management of groups like Billy Squier, Cyndi Lauper, AC/DC, and Foreigner, just to name a few. So how did I meet Stewart? Well, picking up the story, Stewart took the job with ELP, but had no idea what being a manager was all about. So at the suggestion of Greg Lake, he went to see two people, the group's record label head, Ahmet Ertegun, president of Atlantic Records, and Frank Barcelona, the head of Premier Talent, the band's booking agent. One of the first things that Stewart learned was that he needed a great road manager. I was working for ELP's manager at the time, Dee Anthony, who had not yet been told about Stewart. And Dee had sent me on the road with ELP. I got along great with the band, and I was able to solve many of the problems on the road that inevitably happen. The band was impressed and told Stewart to hire me away from Dee so that I could be their tour manager, and that's exactly what happened. After that tour, I moved to London and worked with Stewart and ELP on and off for the next few years. And Stewart and I have remained friends ever since. Stewart lives in London, and we recently sat down to talk about the old days. We pick up the conversation with Stewart discussing a gig he arranged for ELP.
I remember many years later, I had this idea to do a big American tour with Emerson, Lake and Palmer and the Allman Brothers, and I chose 6 Southern bands, like Marshall Tucker Band and bands like this. And I remember going to the boys and telling them the idea because I wanted to build us up in the South. And they said, but they're nothing to do with us. I said, come on, it'll be fun. And so we did it. And I remember we did it in Georgia or somewhere, Speedway. It was a huge event. But I said to the guys, you got to let them finish. They got to close the show. And they said, why? We're bigger than them. I said, don't worry about that. They play for 5 hours. You don't want to come on stage at 3 o'clock in the morning. So the guy said, okay, but what we've got to do is we've got to have a big ending to the set. Why don't we do a lot of fireworks? Yeah, that's a great idea. So we organized a load of fireworks. And I remember Barbara Skydell was at that show.
Barbara Skydell was Frank Barcelona's right hand from Premier Talent.
That's right.
Yeah,
that's
sure.
right. And Cecil Corbett was the promoter.
Uh-huh.
And I'd organize a helicopter so we can get a quick exit. Okay? Mm-hmm. But because I wasn't the road tour manager that you were, I was a little naive because I had forgotten about
the fireworks.
So meanwhile, we finished the set, we went down unbelievably well. I got everybody in the helicopter and we flew and we took off. And just as we took off, all the fireworks came up. It was like being in the middle of Vietnam.
Great story. I remember a fireworks episode. I don't know if you'll remember this.
In Rome?
In Rome. that was another time. We were on tour with the boys, and we had those two crazy promoters, those two Italian promoters.
Yeah, Franco Mamoni and Francesca Sanavio.
Right. And they were quite something, weren't they, Stewart? Yeah, I'm sure you remember them quite well.
Very well.
Very well. So we had decided in that show that we would end that show with fireworks. But of course, these guys were not specialists or experts with fireworks.
Oh.
And they set them all up behind the stage by themselves.
Yes.
And then they went and lit them by themselves.
Yes.
And we were very fortunate that we didn't burn down the stadium, the stage, and destroy everything that was there on that particular day.
Yeah. And do you remember what happened with Lucky Man?
My recollection is that the fireworks were actually perfect.
Yeah, but what about the doves?
Oh, I did tell that story. That's a great story, Stewart. I do remember it, but go ahead.
You don't want to tell the story?
No, you tell the story.
Well, Francesco, the Italian promoter, he comes up, and I remember he said to Greg Lake, he said, listen, I've got a wonderful idea. You know, what we should do for Lucky Man, as it's a song of peace, we will get a whole bunch of doves and we will set them free and they'll fly over the audience in Lucky Man. What a beautiful thing. And Greg said, wow, that's clever. I love that. The only problem was that Francesco, although he was Italian, and although he knew about Rome, he forgot it gets very hot in Rome, particularly in the summer. I think it was August or something.
Yeah, it was.
And we're playing this big stadium. I think it was Flaminio or something like
Yes,
that.
it was. It was.
Well, anyway, he's got all the doves and they're all ready, but it's hot. And these doves are in his cages and it's hot. And when it came to Lucky Man, until he had to let the doves off, the doves started flying to take off, but they were buggered by all this heat. They just dropped out. It was like a disaster, dying around. You remember that?
I actually remember that some of the doves never even left the cages.
Exactly.
No matter what we did, we shook the cages, we pushed them, we tried everything we could to get those doves to fly. It was a disaster.
Yeah, but do you remember the next gig?
No, remind me.
The next gig was Bologna.
Okay.
And in Bologna, there was a little problem.
Yeah.
What the problem was, I remember going to the sound check
Okay.
with the guys, another stadium, soccer stadium in Bologna, and Francesco was there with our crew. And our crew were not looking happy. We just turned up from a fantastic lunch. You know the lunch.
Yeah, I know the lunch.
Yeah,
I
we had
remember the
lunch, drunk, we were ready.
Yeah.
And then Francesco says, what would you like today? Oh, no, the production manager said, what do you want today, Stewart? Sound or lights? I said, what do you mean, sound or lights? He said, well, your friend, Francesco, the promoter, is a little sound problem. When you have the sound and the lights together, they fuse out. So we have to make a choice, sound or lights. I look at the band, because I don't know so much. They didn't look too happy either. And Francesco looks at me and says, oh, Stuart, that's not a problem. What we can do is we can play in the floodlights. I said, the floodlights? I said, it's not a football game, it's a rock concert. But anyway, we played that show.
In the floodlights. I do remember that now that you mentioned it. Yes.
So I remember saying to Francesco afterwards, listen, Francesco, I don't know if you're going to last the night, because I think the crew are going to kill you. I said, so. He said, don't worry, I'm going to take them all out. And he took them all out to one of those Italian restaurants with the big bar. And what I heard, I wasn't there, but what I heard, that they drank every single drink in the bar, that it was closed, and they ate, and that Francesco had the money from the gig, and all the money from the gig
went to pay the bar bill.
Yeah, went to pay the bar bill. But I also remember hearing a little story that after all this wonderful hospitality for Francesco, the crew still hadn't forgiven him, and they hung him by his feet
I do recall that.
From the ceiling.
Yes, I do recall that. But if you remember, we had a pretty crazy crew back in those days.
We did.
Pretty crazy crew. And if people want to see some of that, we have some of that posted somewhere on that tour.
Yeah, I mean, it's the Manticore documentary. It's a film. It starts with the 3 trucks with E, L, and P.
That's right.
And in those days, 3 trucks was incredible. Now they have 100 trucks. But in 1973 or 4?
Yeah, something like that.
3 trucks was impressive.
Well, I think those 3 trucks had something like 20 tons worth of equipment.
Yeah.
We did not travel light in those days.
Yeah.
And again, I have to remind people of how difficult that was before computers and cell phones and any of the modern conveniences that we have today. It was quite something that I think we accomplished back in that day.
Yeah.
And I think it was the beginning of what we see today with these large tours and big productions and things of that sort. I think we were sort of ahead of the curve on that one.
But wasn't that the start of your sound company, your sound and lights company?
Yes, that was.
Wasn't that the start of Circus Talent?
It was. That particular tour that you're talking about in Europe was after the American tour. It was a year or 2 later when I had actually left ELP and I had created a company. I had this concept that I could create a company that would provide all services for rock groups on the road. Up until that point, groups used multiple companies for multiple services. So there was a sound company, a lighting company, a production company, etc., etc. My concept in looking at a circus, a self-contained unit, I thought that I could do that. I created that company, and then you were nice enough to hire me to do the first tour that we ever did, the first major tour that we ever did, and that was part of that tour.
Yeah.
And that was quite an accomplishment, I think, that we did back then.
Was one of your partners there from a sound company?
Yeah.
Didn't they have these very big kind of W bins? What do they call those?
You know, this is quite an interesting story. When I formed the company, I needed a sound and light production company to partner with. I had the other aspects together, but I didn't have the sound and lighting. And there was this very forward-thinking company called Kelsey Morris.
Yeah.
And they were the first ones to ever do anything digitally. So we had the first digital light board, if you remember.
Bill Kelsey.
Bill Kelsey, that's right. He was the one actually who had created the digital lighting board. His partner was an interesting man named Jim Morris.
Yeah.
I had met Jim Morris through an old girlfriend of mine. Putty was an old girlfriend, and she had been a girlfriend from college. She moved to England, and I was living here, and we reconnected. And she married a guy named Peter Watts. And Peter Watts was the road manager for a group called the Pretty Things, and then went on to be road manager and sound engineer for the Pink Floyd. And Jim Morris and his then girlfriend, Judy, I think was her name, they were upstairs neighbor of Putty and Peter, and they were very, very friendly. And I got friendly with Peter, and as I told them about my ideas with Circus Talents, they said, oh, you must meet Jim Morris, because Jim Morris has this wonderful company, and you'll like him. And so, sure enough, I met Jim, and we formed Circus Talents, and we went on from there. Now, I think we were some of the first to have, and people will remember this from going to rock concerts, those big silver cases. And they were huge, and they could fit lots of equipment in it. And that's what we used to transport all our sounding lighting equipment. Well, unbeknownst to me, my partner had another little business going that I wasn't quite aware of until many years later. And what that business was he was affiliated with a man named Howard Morris, I believe was his name.
No, Howard Marks.
Howard Marks, you're right.
Mr. Nice Guy.
Mr. Nice Guy was the name.
Yeah, I know that because I was in my father's office one day, and my dad came up to me and he said, Stewart, you have a visitor. And he was looking at me strangely. I said, yes, he's a policeman and he wants to talk to you. And I'm thinking, what the hell does he want to talk to me? He can't want to talk to me about the joint I just smoked. So I said, okay, we better do it in your office, Dad. And he's going, yeah, I think so. So I go to the office and I see my father there sitting down, and there was a guy. And the guy introduces himself to me, and he's head of the drug squad. So I am already feeling a little worried. Anyway, he's smiling at me, so I think, well, it can't be so bad. So after we shook hands, he said to me, yeah, the reason why I wanted to meet you is we have a reason to believe that there's a guy called Jim Morris who is smuggling drugs, marijuana, hash, in the bass bins of Emerson, Lake and Palmer and Pink Floyd. And I said, really? Shit, that explains it. He said, explains what? I said, well, I had to make a deal with Jim. And the guys told me, yeah, make a tough deal with him. So I can't remember what the amount was, but say he was charging, I don't know, 10 grand a week or something. I said to him, hey, Jim, this is too much. We're only going to pay 2,500 a week. And he immediately said, yeah, no problem. So when I told it to the boys, they said, yeah, that's great. That just proves you're the best negotiator. Obviously, I realized now why he was doing it.
And I, by this point, was on the other side of the Atlantic, and I had a little visit as well.
No.
Oh, yes.
I didn't know that.
Yes, I had already, by this point, parted ways with Jim, and I let him buy me out of the company.
Right.
So he basically retained all of the equipment. Got a knock on my door, and it was the FBI. And they said, do you know a man named Jim Morris? I said, sure. He was my partner in England in a production company. And they said, well, is he still your partner? And I explained to him, as I explained to you, no, we had parted ways. He kept the equipment. We worked out a settlement. I came back here. They said, well, do you know what he was doing with that equipment? I said, yeah, he was doing rock tours. That's what we did. They said, no. Don't be cute with us. Do you know what was in that equipment? I said, yes. We traveled with our sound equipment, our lighting equipment. This went on for a while, and I got wind of the fact that something was going on. But over time, they seemed to start to believe my story. I guess I was pretty incredulous, and my reactions were pretty much so off the cuff that they realized that I probably didn't know what was going on. And then they explained to me that the cases all had false bottoms, and that there was a big compartment underneath the case, and that all these cases were being used to transport hashish across Europe. And I was blown away. I mean, I had no idea. And fortunately, they didn't implicate me, and I was off the hook. But to this day, I believe they never have caught him.
Oh, no.
I don't think he was ever seen again.
There were rumors about he had his fingerprints changed.
And plastic surgery. I heard he had plastic surgery.
I don't know. I guess you'd have to ask Howard Marks.
So, Stewart, thinking about equipment problems and how much equipment we had and how difficult it was to travel around with it reminds me of the time when we were very nervous about playing Madison Square Garden.
Oh, yeah?
If you remember, back in the day, America was very unionized.
Oh, yeah.
And the Teamsters were really the union that we had to deal with most, because they were the guys that wanted to load in and load out. The problem with that is we wanted to do it ourselves. We carried large road crews, and we knew exactly how we wanted to do it, and we needed to do it within a certain time frame to make sure we could be set up in time, have our sound check, get out in time to get to the next gig.
Oh, yeah.
Often with people like the Teamsters, they would do it a little slower than maybe we wanted to do it, and that could cause tremendous problems when we had so much equipment and we needed so much lead time. Now, again, you may remember that I came from a family where my father and uncle had a trucking company. And so they had many dealings with the Teamsters. And when you and I discussed the problem, I said to you, let me go and see if my father's got a solution for us. Father came back and he said, I know a few people who may be able to help you. Let me talk to Stewart. You guys will go to a certain affair that one of these guys has at the Waldorf, and maybe you'll develop a relationship, and maybe the guy will help you. Do you remember that?
Yeah, how could I forget it?
Why don't you tell the story from your perspective?
Okay. So, yeah, the event was at the Waldorf. And didn't we have to have a black tie or something?
Well, actually, yeah, I'll back it up a little bit. So I called you up, and you were in New York, and I said, come on, my father wants to talk to us. We went to my father's office, and he had met you before, and he knew you and had a little bit of a relationship. And he knew that you didn't always, let's say, dress for the occasion as far as he was concerned.
Yeah.
So he was quite concerned that when we went to this affair, we were dressed properly and that we acted properly. And I'll let you take it from there.
Yeah. So I remember it was at the Waldorf Astoria. There was a huge amount of people there. I had to have kind of a black tie. I didn't even have a tie. I didn't wear a tie.
I recall that.
I thought the reason why I got out of being an accountant and got into the music business was I didn't have to wear a tie. Anyway, I remember we get there and we're on the same table as this guy. He was like the head of the Teamster Union. Everybody was treating him with incredible carefulness. And we're sitting now talking to him, right?
Yeah.
And didn't you explain to him the problem?
Yeah, my father brought us over to his table.
Yeah.
He invited us to sit down, and if you remember, he was like a little balding guy, a little heavy-set, big cigar stub in his mouth.
A caricature.
A real caricature.
Yeah.
So my father introduces us, and then I introduce you.
Yeah.
And we tell him about Emerson Lake and Palmer, about our potential problem, about playing at the Garden.
Yeah. I remember that vaguely.
Yes.
I remember the cigar.
Yes.
I remember the look. I seem to remember I did something that wasn't quite politically correct.
Well, I think you did many things that evening that weren't politically correct.
Didn't I cause your father to sweat a bit?
Oh, you caused my father to sweat tremendously, and I could tell by his face as we were talking, particularly as you were talking to this gentleman, he was, excuse the expression, shitting in his pants.
No, yeah. And do you remember what I said?
I think I do, but I'd like you to tell it the way you remember it.
Yeah, the trouble is I don't remember it.
Well, basically, as I recall, everybody was a bit afraid of this man.
I remember that.
And everybody treated him with a certain amount of respect. And you, in your usual way, treated him as you treat everybody else.
Yeah, you mean like as a normal person?
I mean like as a normal person. And I don't think this gentleman was talked to by very many people in that way.
Yeah.
But as I recall, he liked it.
He loved it.
He loved it.
Because I don't remember what I said to him, but I disagreed with something, and I said something, and I remember your father giving me the look. But I remember him, I can't remember his name, but I remember he liked it, and then he invited me to his house.
Why don't you tell us that story, because it's quite an interesting story.
Yeah, so he invited me to the house, and he sent a car for me to come to the hotel. And I think the house was somewhere in Long Island.
I'm sure it was, because a lot of those union guys lived together in certain parts of
and he sent this
New York.
big limo, and we go out to the house. I think it was a Sunday or something, for lunch. But I remember when we got into the gate, there was a long drive, and I saw a guy there with a shotgun or something at the gate, and I realized it wasn't the normal kind of house. And I remember going in and having a wonderful lunch, and we got on really well. He gave me cigars and everything. It was pretty cool, actually. We had a good discussion. And the thing is, I remember going to tell Frank Barcelona about that, the discussion. Frank, who was the band's agent.
And the head of Premier Talent, which of course was the rock and roll booking agent of the day.
And so when he said to me, whose house did you go to? And I told him, wish I could remember the name of the guy. He went white. He said, you went to his house? and you got out alive, and he's agreed to do this? I can't believe it. But he kept his word.
Yeah, needless to say, we never had a problem again with the Teamsters Union at any gig, anywhere in America, did we?
Yeah, I think he probably had his eye on me for his daughter, I think.
I think he probably did. Might not have been the worst thing in the world. I do remember that experience, and I'm grateful that he reacted the way he did. Because I think he was a powerful man, and he could have made a lot of trouble for us, and he didn't.
I just think I was probably a bit naive. So I said things to him. If I hadn't have been so naive, I would never have said it looking him in the eyes, and he just appreciated it.
You know, I think in the end he was a regular person, and he just appreciated your honesty.
Yeah.
And I think that was really good on all parts and a good outcome. And in the end, my father breathed a sigh of relief. And he was very happy about that. Okay, some great stories for sure. And we'll hear more from my conversation with Stewart on later podcasts. Okay, that's it for today. I hope you enjoyed it, and be sure to join me on Facebook at Neil Ratner Rock Doc and listen to my This Week in Rock segments at 3 p.m. on Saturdays and Sundays on WDST Radio Woodstock. And of course, I will see you right back here on the Woodstock Podcast Network for another episode of Music is Medicine.